Hi everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am with a very special person today, Carrie Doubts. Carrie is a transformational coach specializing in grief, and she is the founder of Life's Next Chapter Coaching. But Carrie is also the reader that I had at the University of Santa Monica. And it was there when I was studying that I decided to study death and grieving. And it was just this really incredible serendipitous meeting of minds, because I didn't know that Carrie specialized in grief work. So it just means it really does mean a lot to me that we get to sit together on this series and talk about a subject close to both of our hearts.
Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me, Tara. It's just great to see you, to be part of this series. I think that the work you're doing is so important to, have these conversations about grief. And yes, it was just really a synchronous thing that we got paired up as, me being your faculty reader. And I just, so I've been following you, and it's really great to see you here and to welcome your listeners as well.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I kind of begin each interview with the same question, asking everybody, what is grief, or what is your definition of grief? Because it's just fascinating to hear the different interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, loss and grief are part of life. Loss, if we love deeply, we're going to suffer pain of grief when, what we loved is no longer there. And, we're going to look at grief in terms of, in my own personal experience, it was my own divorce that led me to specialize in grief coaching. And then my mother passed. So there was that level of grieving. And as you know, I lost my husband just 4 weeks ago. And so what I know about grief and grief counseling and grief coaching has really served me well personally. It's like having the map, right? And now I'm walking the territory. So yeah, grief is the natural response to loss. And it's important to recognize that everybody grieves in their own way. And so the intensity and the duration of their grief is going to depend on a few things. So, one thing is, how important was this relationship to the person, or whether the person experienced multiple losses at the same time, or in a short period of time, and they haven't had enough time to adapt to each one. Also, the number of secondary losses that are attached to this one, so sometimes when you go through a divorce, you lose your community, you lose the home that you brought your kids up in, things like that. And the state of the person's physical and mental health also, and their capacity for resilience is also going to affect the process of grieving. And a big one is the quality of support that people receive.
Yeah.
And so, as we know, it affects us on the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, the social levels. And, what's difficult is the feeling level, usually. It's like people experiencing extreme sadness, anger, fear, guilt, loneliness, all of that stuff. And it feels like an emotional roller coaster. That's exactly what I'm on right now. There's good days, there's in between days, and there's bad ones. And nobody likes feeling this, but these feelings have a life of their own. We can't really control our feelings as much as we want to do that, but if we just ride them out, and I'll talk with you a little later about some of the ways that it's helpful for people to approach their feelings. And so you and I had also talked about some of the limiting beliefs on how to grieve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just really want to acknowledge your loss of your husband.
Yeah.
This is like a really, really difficult time for you right now. So I just wholeheartedly appreciate you showing up and like you say, walking your talk, Carrie, using your tools in this unimaginable time. So yeah, what have you been feeling like personally? Like maybe just share some of these.
All of it,
Yeah.
all of it. The shock and the numbness. It was a sudden death, of my husband, and I was there with him when he passed, but still at the same time there was this sort of traumatic experience to it. So I'm kind of having to relive the trauma of that, at times, and that is no fun, and the sadness, anger, the also just the there's kind of like also a quiet gratitude for the life that we shared together, and just a real respect for him that we're doing the memorial service next week, and his family and my family are coming in, and it's just that way of paying our respects to who I think is a great man. He was a great man, so I feel his loss deeply.
Yes, I'm sure. Thank you for sharing that, Carrie.
Sure. And go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I am really familiar now with the limitations, the limiting beliefs that are out there, as far as what people are told about how to grieve well. And, one of these is like, you should, grieve alone, just don't share your pain and your sadness. Like it's a sign of weakness to display your emotions. And another one is, you shouldn't feel bad. He's in a better place. I heard that so many times. And it's just like not helping, it's, and another one is you need to be strong for others. Be strong, and like keeping busy is the best way to handle your grief and distract yourself from feeling it. And I definitely, there are models of grieving that talk about the resilient coping behaviors, and then this, the expression of the feelings, and you just oscillate between these two things. But to be incessantly busy and distract yourself from feeling what you feel, it's not going to be helpful, and that time alone, the passing of time, will heal the hurt. And you hear people saying, oh, it was a year ago, you should be over it by now. And that is so not true. It's everybody grieves differently. And what does help is accepting that grief is not something you need to fix. It's an experience that needs to be respected and accepted, both by ourselves and by those people in our community.
Yeah, I think that's lovely. It's something to be held and respected, and it's true. A lot of the time people say these things to us very well-meaning, but often not with the sort of knowledge and understanding that comes with it when you've experienced it yourself. So yeah.
I was experiencing that this past weekend. I took myself to a meditation retreat, which was very helpful. And yet at the same time, a lot of the people that were there, when I said, oh, I just lost my husband 3 weeks ago, and they would launch into their stories about, oh, well, he's not here in the physical, but, and just, reframing for me, and telling their story about how they lost their mom and all the things that they did. And one guy was doing that, and I guess my eyes just kind of glazed over. It was at night, late at night, and I was tired. And he said, is this helping? And just out of my mouth said, no.
You know what might be helpful? Being on a silent retreat.
Right. And then, it was like, he was crushed, and he came over and hugged me, and he was crying. And I said, this is what helps. That's all you got to do. Just give me a hug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's so true. We do. We whether it's being held physically with a hug, or just having someone to hold the space and be in the silence with us. And yeah, it's so true.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you in particular about complicated grief, because obviously you have a wealth of experience, and actually it's a question that's come up for me recently. So sometimes I wonder, even with my own mother, whether I had a complicated grief in a sense, because there were things that I realized, that I was angry about. I kind of realized I was angry that she died, because I felt like there were some points where perhaps she could have fought harder and things like that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on complicated grief.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that people are, wondering, am I normal? Is my grief normal? Right. And there's times when grieving goes kind of what's outside the spectrum of what's considered normal, right? And so with most psychological diagnoses, there's a continuum, right? From mental health, from what is normal on one end, to psychopathology on the other. And so, just for an example, obsessive compulsive disorder is on one end of the spectrum, but having a focused attention to detail might be in the normal range, right? But once grieving has left what's considered the bounds of normal, it's called complicated grief. And it can be incapacitating, and people experiencing it really are at high risk. And it's a disruption, a kind of a disruption of the normal grief process, and it prohibits healthy closure and healing. And so it's going to manifest as a response or a reaction that could be like a prolonged grief, goes on for a long, long time, or a delayed grief where people don't get a chance to grieve because they've got a, and then all of a sudden their grief reaction is delayed. It can be a distorted grieving, where there's mental distortions. It can be where there's no grief, no outward signs of grief, but the person is really just not in touch with it, right? So it seems absent. Excessive grief, where people just can't stop crying, can't function, can't get out of bed. Unresolved, layered grief, that's where we have, again, just many losses all at once, or a trauma related grief can push people into a complicated grieving process. And, another indicator is if a person's experiencing multiple losses simultaneously and having difficulty grieving each one separately. Right. For example, I talked to a woman, I interviewed her as a possible client. She had lost her husband and 2 children in a car accident, and she barely survived it herself. And this is, very complicated grief, because it's not just one, but loss of an entire family, and loss of our own health and functioning in some ways as well. So that's certainly a complicated grief example. And people who have a history of depression, or clinical depression, they can be at a greater risk for experiencing complicated grief. And I came across a really astonishing statistic that 14 to 30% of grieving people will develop complicated grief. And that's staggering, And so this large number of people experiencing this kind of grief, they're going to need some kind of therapeutic help, with the grieving process, to have a chance to adapt and to rebuild their lives. And, some of these have kind of like a gray area of interpretation, and different cultural norms also can cloud over the issue, because different cultures grieve differently, right? Yeah. And so, what could be considered normal in one culture could be considered excessive or complicated in another. So we've got all these overlaying, factors of it. And, these adjectives that I just, they're like one spectrum of meaning. So for instance, what does prolonged mean? According to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, bereavement symptoms that last more than 2 months after the time of loss might be considered what they call a major depressive episode. And, I don't think 2 months is, a long time to be experiencing grief. That's not into the psychopathology arena at all, from my point of view.
Yeah.
But, if the person meets one or more of these criteria for complicated grief, they're going to be better served in the care and treatment of a therapist than, I think, a grief coach or a grief counselor. So I think it's important, if people are coaching in this arena, that they really understand the scope of practice. Like I said, that woman that I interviewed, I quickly saw that this was outside the scope of practice for me as a grief coach. And I referred her on to some really capable therapists. And so, we want to stay in our lane. It's my position that normal grief can really be well supported by grief coaches and counselors, because it's not a disease, and it doesn't require fixing, and it doesn't require treatment. It requires, support.
Yeah.
And so if people are wondering if what they're experiencing is normal or complicated, I would encourage them to, have a conversation with a therapist or a grief counselor, and then they can let you know. Is that helpful?
That's so helpful. And I completely agree about referring people, when something is out of your realm of capability, because like you say, some people are just going to be much more adept at helping, at certain points. So
Yeah, they may need, medications. They may need other assists that we just can't give. So, what's best for the client or the patient has got to be what guides the decision whether to take on a client or not.
absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about unprocessed grief.
Yeah.
Because, one of my motivations of even doing this series is a lot to do with my mum, because I often felt that she didn't tend to her grief. And my father died very suddenly of a heart attack. And then there was a series of big losses in her life, but she was very much on the busy treadmill. And then she got breast cancer. And then, she died of breast cancer. So I've often looked at the back and thought, I wonder if she had tended more to her grief, if that would have happened. So that's just one personal example. But in your experience, how do we even know if we're carrying it?
Well, in my work, often when I talk with a new person, they're going to show up as feeling kind of stuck in their life. There's some area that they can't move forward. They're just not able to move forward. And that can get in the way of relationships or work, or it's like life feels kind of choked off, like you're only living in a few rooms of your house, right? All these other rooms are just off limits. You're just not going there, And the problem is that these rooms also contain joy and purpose and aliveness, as well as the sorrow. So if you're living a small, kind of limited version of yourself in your life, I tend to look at, is there an unprocessed grief here? And another sign is addictions. They're often rooted in unprocessed grief. Where numbing out, from feeling the pain really becomes a habit and then a way of life. It's that kind of maladaptive coping strategy that people use to numb themselves from the pain of loss, and then that becomes a bigger problem for them. Yeah. There's some huge statistic about tracing the origins of many addictions to some kind of unprocessed loss or grief.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I always talk about how we're so pain avoidant. So then we just want to move away from it as quickly as possible. And we're so, our lives are so comfortable, aren't they? I was just like, even looking at renovating a property, and it's like, do you want these light switches that, you dim lights exact level of the time of day, and I'm thinking, well, that is absolutely ridiculous, but this is like the way that where we've got to, and comfort levels in our lives, isn't it? We have warm beds and warm showers and all the food in the world that we want, and so whenever we feel some pain, we panic, any discomfort or pain, and
Yeah,
of
try
course
to
we want to
medicate.
medicate, yeah, in whatever way, shape or form.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I know for myself, my form of self-medication is I love to eat. So I'm
Same.
eating everything that's not nailed down, basically.
Well, we'll give you lots and lots of permission to do that. But yes, my gosh, I can relate to that very, very much, because I felt like you were talking about not living in the many rooms of your house. It's like when you've had trauma, then you develop the mechanism of numbing out, right? Don't you? So then, you sort of you have that level of numbing out, but you can't change that level of numbing out for the things that are fun or exciting or joyful. You can't adapt that sort of numb volume. And so
Right.
then you don't fully like enjoy your life when you're
Yeah.
in that protective mode, because you're like, this was so painful, I don't want to feel that pain or trauma again. And then you don't have the full range of life, the full range of emotions to experience life.
Yeah. That's so well said. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I know that you coach in this transformational way.
Mm.
So how do you sort of coach people around, using these painful experiences in our life as opportunities of transformation?
Well, and you know how it is. Pain gets our attention. You know,
Right.
it's like, wake up. you know, and so it has our full attention. And a lot of times, people will come to me because they want to, figure out how to stop feeling this. But my encouragement to them is this is a transformational opportunity to the extent that it shakes you up and wakes you up and gets your attention. It can be as you start to have a relationship with your grief, it can really show you the way to becoming a better person, to becoming a more whole person.
Mm.
And so it is just it, it can sound a little counterintuitive to call it an opportunity, but grief does have its gifts. But you
Mm.
have to, in order to open those gifts and to find them, you really have to go in there. You really have to be willing to go in there. And sometimes that's very hard on your own.
Mm.
So to try to do that alone can be very daunting because you can get lost there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And do you, obviously you work with people on a one-to-one,
Mhm.
but how do you do groups as well?
Yeah, I do a lot of group work. This lends itself very well to group work. And the kind of group work that I do is very different from much of the layperson, groups that are out there that, uh, you know, there's, for me, there's a focus on, yes, you are in this grieving period and we're going to support you and kind of hold your hand through that. But the main thing that we're going to be looking at is what is the life that you want to create for yourself on the other side of this grieving experience, on the other side of this adaptation? And it's not like we ever leave grieving, in terms of that it's over, that it's done.
Mhm.
We build a life that takes grief with us
Mhm.
rather than trying to leave it alone, leave it behind, because it does become a way of, again, honoring love. That which we love and we lose is going to change our lives.
Yeah.
It's not like that we're going to feel sad forever, but we're always going to have that place in our hearts, where that person or that, thing that was lost is
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
So do you just sort of do practices around integrating the people that we've loved but lost into the existing life that we have now?
I'm very respectful of that because it is one of what William Worden called the tasks of mourning. The first thing is to accept the loss,
Yeah.
to accept what's happened. And then we have to kind of take a look at our identities. So if you were a wife, if you were a mother, and you no longer have those rules, you have to reintegrate a new self identity and a new world viewpoint of the world as well. Some people get really shaken up in terms of not seeing the world as a safe place anymore. So they need to really reintegrate how they meet the world again too. And one of the last what they call tasks of mourning is, it's not that we get closure and we leave that relationship behind, we create a new relationship with the person who's passed. And for some people it's like, well, I just talk to him like he's here, or I see him in my dreams, or I see her when I um, just ask for guidance. So it's very different for everyone. I would never prescribe that this is what you're looking for, but you're going to find some way of reframing the relationship.
And when you work with people, do you have a sort of, if somebody calls you like yourself, and you lost your husband 4 weeks ago, would you say, yeah, we can get to work right away? Or do you say, let's wait for a little bit of time after you've arranged the funeral or the memorial, so some of the sort of shock wears off? Or I was just curious about that.
You're raising a really great question, because it really depends on the person's capacity to engage in the work. If they're in the shock and the numbness and the denial stages, they wouldn't be ready. They might be better served by seeing a therapist first. And sometimes I work with people co-jointly with therapists, because I tell them, your therapist is really going to help you to, integrate emotionally. And, I can come along aside that person and alongside you to start getting in touch with, who are you and what do you want now that this huge life transition has happened. A lot of times people really need to examine those very deep questions, because if we've identified ourselves as a wife and mother and we are no longer that, and if we've had our dreams and goals tied up with those of another person, a partner. So I do a lot of work with people who lost a life partner, because so much of what we create for ourselves together, then we got to let go of that. Well, we were going to move to Australia. Now, do I even want to? So it's like, who are you and what do you want? Are big questions that we address both in groups or in individual coaching. I have a nine-step process for rebuilding your life after loss. And so, I take people through that either as a group or individually. And it's like, it's one of those things, again, people have common experiences, but they have individual responses.
Yeah. Yeah, I think somebody else said to me, your grief is as unique as your fingerprint.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very true. We can't compare ourselves to anyone else's process.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that I think when people start, getting some support, just to normalize their process, just to understand, oh, yeah, this is what happens. That you're experiencing, it's not at all uncommon.
Yeah.
Because people start to feel like, oh, I'm so, I'm having that sort of symptom of, I can't focus and concentrate on things very well, and I'm like losing my keys, and It's like I feel like, I've got that foggy brain thing going on. So I don't expect a lot of myself right now. I know when I hit my limit and I go lie down because I'm not going to push and demand against myself right now.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Gotta be so, like you were saying, grief can make us much more compassionate
Yes.
towards others, but we really need to remember to place that towards ourselves all the time as well.
Bingo. Absolutely true.
And
Yeah.
exhaustion is obviously such a key element to grief, just feeling so tired all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And you were talking about your process that you take other people through. And I know that you had a process that you might lead us through, because I've been asking if you've had an interpretation of conscious grief.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, my definition of grieving consciously is really making the decision to stay awake and present while you're in the grieving process. To meet yourself, to meet your grief, and to meet the pain of the loss of love, and with courage and with compassion and patience, rather than trying to push it aside or avoid it or numb it or get past it, to hurry up through it. And I teach my clients a process that helps them have what we call a conscious conversation with grief.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I could take us through that process now if you like. So, just get yourself into a comfortable place while you're sitting, and you can either keep your eyes open or closed, whatever works well for you. And just feel your body in the chair and feel your feet on the floor. Just notice that grounding energy that comes from connecting to the earth. And just take a deep breath into that. We're going to take a series of 4 breaths together just to bring ourselves into a place of receptivity to the gifts of grief. So take in a deep breath. And this first breath is acknowledgement. If you're grieving right now, there's a lot here. There's a lot happening. And as you breathe that first breath of acknowledgement, just allow your body to relax into the awareness that's here for you now. No need to change anything. We're just acknowledging what's here. And then take a second breath of acceptance. And acceptance is really just letting go of needing to have this be any different, just for right now. Just accepting yourself as you are. And then take a deep breath of appreciation. Appreciation for yourself, all the ways that you're working through this grief, all the ways that this grief has helped you and served you. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. But we can still appreciate ourselves as we go through it, and our strength and our courage. And then take a fourth breath of allowing. And this is allowing the energy to become what it wants to become. And in this allowing, we explore with some questions. So, what's wanting to emerge in the space in between you and the grief that you feel? What's wanting to happen here? Could be a greater sense of peace, of loving, of kindness towards yourself. of slowing down. And what does your grief want you to know? What message does it have for you? And what does your grief need from you right now? Just continue deeply breathing and listening to the answers that come from that space in between you and the grief. Could be a word or a sound or an image. Whatever is there, it's perfect for you. Take a breath into that energy of that emerging discovery. What wants to happen? And ask your grief to share with you who it's asking you to be. What qualities are being asked of you? Could be courage, could be self-honoring. Again, it could be loving kindness towards yourself and others, patience. Just keep breathing and being with what's present for you. And in a moment, we'll bring that to completion. And so let's bring that to completion. And you may want to jot down some notes of what you heard in that conversation with grief. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes.
Oh, Carrie, thank you so much. You have such a perfect voice for that.
I'm taking the words in myself too. Yeah.
Yeah. I know, I was thinking of you very much during that process.
I use that process with myself. I got my little sticky note reminder right here. When life gets a little bit too much, I just take in those 4 breaths.
Yeah, so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, so many of us try to get rid of or fix our negative feelings or rationalize our way through the process, think our way through it. It doesn't work very well. We need to meet our feelings. They just have information for us.
Yes, it's so true, they do. And in a way, we're privileged if we feel everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because then we're given much more information about the decisions that we need to make or what we need to give ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. What I've noticed is I'm feeling very guided in that way. If I just slow down and when you lose a life partner, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. And so I'm just listening inside, from a deeper place and receiving guidance, as well as, yes, no, do, don't. Very, very clear in a lot of ways.
Wow.
And I had my days like yesterday where I just completely had a meltdown, so we're human,
Yeah. And that, what you shared earlier about 2 months, I mean, that is just ludicrous. And I think that really goes to show how misunderstood this emotion is.
Yeah. It can definitely feel that way, like you feel misunderstood
Yeah.
by people in general. And so when you do find someone who understands, who, as Ellen Wolfelt talks about, companioning with someone through their grief, you're just there with them. You're not trying to lead them. You're not trying to nudge them, or you're just there with them. And there's great books, written, especially by him. I love his work. And, it is, it's important also to find a support system, people who can be there with you and just
I'm
allow you to
so,
talk.
so glad actually that you mentioned him, because I was just looking down, because normally I have his book next to me somewhere, but the 10 touchstones of
Yes.
grief.
Yeah.
Yes. And that was a book you told me to read.
Oh,
And it, oh my gosh, I was like, just reading that book, it's like, oh my God, my life suddenly made sense after so many years of struggling,
yeah.
Yeah.
There's really great books out there, so, and there's great people out there who really want to step into your life and support you in a way that works for you if you're going through a grief event. And, it's important to sort of identify who those people are and stick with them and boundary the others, because there's going to be people who are toxic, there's going to be people who are neutral, and there's going to be people who are supportive. And you really want to boundary yourself around the toxicity, because you find, people just don't have the capacity to deal with that.
Yes, I know. I was laughing in another interview because I have not read Harry Potter. Bad me, but she I know, I was like, what are you talking about? He said that the muggles, I call the people that have never been touched by trauma, muggles, and they always say the wrong thing. And I will never forget that comment. The toxic muggles, that's what we'll call them.
Well, and I think generally people mean well.
Exactly.
They're doing something that they think is helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel you. I get you. I've been through this. Carolyn Mace talks about this. We tend to love to connect with people at the area of our wounds, right? And so it's like, oh, you've got this wound. I've got that wound too. We can connect. But it just doesn't. It just falls flat, because, as we said, everyone grieves differently. Your process of grief will probably look nothing like mine.
Yeah. Well, Carrie, I am just so grateful to you for leading me towards this series, honestly, and and just so grateful that you were able to be here in the midst of your grief.
Thank you.
Yeah, truly, thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I think, again, just it's a day by day, minute by minute process sometimes, and just put that into the container of love and acceptance that you need to be in, when you're going through something this difficult. And so just to be completely patient and gentle and honest with yourself about what you need.
Yeah.
And, asking for support and asking for the right kind of support could really be helpful to people, when they're going through this, when they feel like they have to carry this alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also, for the listeners, you gave a free, do you want to, you introduce it?
Sure, I forget what it was. It was a course. I have some online courses. I think this one was about breaking free from worry, how to let go and find peace in the face of life's uncertainties. How we tend to just,
go round and around in the loop.
in the loop.
Yeah, so we'll have a link to that below this interview. So yeah, I really encourage everybody to take that free offer.
Yeah, the self-paced course. So
yeah. Well, again, thank you so much, Carrie, and keep in touch. And yeah, I will.
Thank you to you, Carrie, for the work you're doing, and just thanks to the listeners for being interested in this and listening.
Yeah. To everybody at home, thank you again for listening, and see you again. Lots of love. Bye bye.